Hello there, Drew Hanisch in another whiskey comparison video, and today I am doing a tasting of rye whiskeys. Rye is something I've wanted to cover for a while because I've dabbled in ryes, but usually it's in isolation. I taste one, then I'm on tasting other things, then I taste one, then I'm on with other things. And I've had a really interesting experience in hearing other people's thoughts on rye. When I did my first trip across Kentucky, I kept hearing tour guides and people in restaurants saying that rye is not something that women tend to like. And what I found was when I asked women about it, they would say, "Ooh, I like rye," you know? And I think there's this perception that because it is a more rugged grain, that it's not going to be something that women are going to like because there's a lot of spice in it, a lot of black pepper you'll get into certain ryes. But I think what they're missing is the fact that rye is complex and it gives you a lot of different flavors, and it's something you sit with, and there's floral, herbal aspects to it. All this comes out of there as well. So very interesting to try to figure out, whether this appeals to this palate or that palate. Part of the reason why I put the poll out on Instagram about do you prefer in your ryes a higher proof or an older age is because I think there is a definite line between the two in terms of what your drinking preference is, that you're going to choose one over the other for a particular reason. Okay, and so I'm going to get into that a little bit as I introduce to you the three whiskeys that I'm going to be going through today. First is Pendleton 1910, beautiful bottle here with a picture of a horse here, a bucking bronco. This is named actually after the Pendleton Rodeo, which is one of the biggest rodeos in the United States, and it's gone on since 1910. So therein comes the name, Pendleton 1910. Interesting thing about this whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume. It is a 12-year-old whiskey that I bought for $20. I was just going to do tasting on these two, but I was going through a store the other day and I saw this on the shelf with a sale sticker on it. It's usually around 35 to 40. And I said, maybe they can't sell it. Maybe that's a statement for what it's going to taste like, but I got to give it a shot and see what it's like. So what's interesting about this is it's actually made by the Hood Distiller. Well, it's not actually made, it's made in Canada. It's imported and then it's bottled at Hood River Distillers. And so it's mentioned as a product of Canada. It is 100% rye whiskey. And that makes it different from my other two guests. Next up on the list is Rittenhouse Rye. For my friends in Philadelphia, you may recognize that name, Rittenhouse. And yes, Rittenhouse Square is the inspiration behind the name for this. If you read the bottle, though, it's going to tell you that Rittenhouse Straight Rye Whiskey is a storied Pennsylvania-style rye. So what is a Pennsylvania-style rye? Well, as far as I can tell, it's a marketing thing, because the only Pennsylvania style I can think of for rye is Monongahela. And Monongahela, while it may have some corn in it, it doesn't have 37% corn in it, which is what this is. And it has, this is 51% rye. So this has half the rye in it that this does. This is made by Heaven Hill in Bardstown, Kentucky. And it is bottled in bond, so it is 100 proof or 50% alcohol versus this one, which is 40% alcohol. So these are your high proof versus your older age. And to toss into the mix is Sazerac Rye. And Sazerac Rye is made by Buffalo Trace. They make this for the Sazerac House in New Orleans. And if you ever get a chance to go to Sazerac House in New Orleans, I highly recommend it. Great tour, lots of history, learn about cocktails, get to taste a couple of things along the way, including the Sazerac, which is one of my favorite cocktails. And so, again, you know, rye, it's interesting because the history of rye is that when the settlers first came over, George Thorpe was the first one to distill something as a European in America, as far as we know. And he was at Jamestown and he made a corn whiskey. But after that, rum became the thing until all of a sudden there were all sorts of taxes and duties and colonists uprising, and here we go. Well, what are we going to do to rebel? We're going to drink our own spirits. And so, using the grain that was around in the Northeast, they made their whiskeys out of rye. And this is partially where Monongahela got started, and all of this before everybody migrated down to Kentucky and started making corn whiskey. If you go to Canada, lots of rye whiskey. That's because it's a grain that is widely available. So that's kind of a little background on rye. What's interesting about rye is that after Prohibition, it pretty much disappeared. I mean, it was very hard to find. And the Sazerac was a big reason why rye whiskey started to gain favor again. And now for cocktails, it is really big. So the profiles I'm going to give you on these whiskeys will also help you in understanding how you might use these in cocktails as well. So let's get started with the Pendleton 1910, the Rodeo whiskey, which seems to have like a little bit of it has a spice to it. It's like a baking spice. But the thing that really stands out on this is the amount of almost like a gasoline kind of a nose to it. It's actually not an overly pleasant nose for me. There's leather in there. There's a little tobacco in there. I don't know, it's a really interesting nose and not what I would have expected from a rye whiskey. But it's not off-putting. But that gasoline, first time I pulled it in my nose, I was like, whoa, gasoline. What is that? Really nice legs on this one and nice mouthfeel. You get a lot of dark fruits in this. Rum, plum. What's interesting, maybe a little cherry in there. And then it goes for kind of like this dark burnt brown sugar on the way out. You notice the one thing I didn't mention? It doesn't have pepper, which is something, black pepper is something that you usually will get a bite out of in rye. I get very, very, very little of that. It's just not really in that kind of a neighborhood. It doesn't necessarily remind me that much of a rye whiskey. Very, very light pepper, very clean on the finish. So if you voted for an older rye, then my guess is that you don't like the bite of rye. You want something where the rye has been muted. A little orange in there too. You want something where the rye has been muted enough. This is an easy drinker. I would say this bottle will be very easy to quickly go through because it's got a nice flavor to it. Probably keep my nose away from it. I mean, it's okay, but it's just not my cup of tea. It might pair well with the cigar, actually, I would say. But yeah, it's interesting because my opinion all along between peated whiskeys and rye whiskeys has been, I don't want one that's got an older age on it because the longer it sits in that cask, the more it loses its personality, the personality of that new make and the way you treat the peated barley or the way that spice grain should stand out to you. But I truly see a great spot for this as just a very drinkable, nice, especially if you're going to invite somebody to get into drinking rye whiskeys, and they're really not sure, that would be an excellent whiskey to get them started on, especially if you can find it for $20 a bottle. I don't think you can do that. I got lucky on that one. All right, this is Rittenhouse. What a change. It really does have a totally different nose. There's a little sweetness of that rye in there, but it's not, it's like a toasted rye. Makes me want to go have a Reuben sandwich. Oh, there's a little top end sweetness in there that just kind of pokes its head through. It's really, really nice. But you have to hunt for it. The oak surrounds it a bit. Yeah, now this is what I think rye is supposed to smell like, but it could be the fact that this has been the only rye I've had in my cabinet for a long time, and only recently have I started growing my rye collection. The corn and the wood really start to show through on this a little bit. Very toffee kind of a caramel thing going on there. There's a little smokiness to it, a little char, I think, that comes through in there. And there is a peppery bite towards the end, more of a peppery heat that kind of lingers in your mouth. It's never overly aggressive. At 100 proof, this is a very smooth experience with enough to tell you, I'm here, check me out, this is what I'm about. Ooh, and then a nice heat down the throat. I've always been impressed by this whiskey. There's a little espresso in there, actually, towards the end. It gets a little yeasty on the finish. And it's a little more dry at the finish. But man, it's got a nice mouthfeel to it in the middle. And the rye does show itself through the entire experience. If you're a bourbon drinker and you're looking to move over to a rye, I would say this is the rye that you're going to probably want to start on, or maybe roll over. If you like higher proof, you may go over to Pikeville and try that. It's been a long time since I've had Pikeville, but I seem to remember that Pikeville, man, there's a lot more flavors that pop out of Pikeville. Our last one is Sazerac. I had to remember to buy this while I was driving through Louisiana because I can't buy this in South Carolina. Well, actually, I say that. I just finally saw a bottle of it the other day, but I got this for like 25 bucks a bottle. This is so herbal. It is that rye is there. It's sweet. It's so present. Man, there's a little cinnamon, there's a little orange in this. A little pine kind of a thing going on. The orange. If you've ever been to Williamsburg and had Williamsburg, it's not orange cake, what is it? It's like a pound cake that they make at the Raleigh Tavern. It reminds me of that. Makes me want to go to Williamsburg. Probably not something that you would hear from the normal Sazerac, lover, but this is going to be on the sweeter side of things. So I would say if you're making a cocktail that requires a sweeter rye whiskey with a lot more body to it, that's more out front, on the sweet side of things, Sazerac is your way. If you want something that's a little more spicy, you're trying to, and you're going for a darker flavor profile, then the Rittenhouse is probably going to work best for you. If you're just going to drink something and you don't need to mix it into any, I would go with this one. Although I would go with any of the three of these. These are all really nice additions to my catalog of whiskeys. So here's how you voted. You said 57% of you want a higher proof and 43% want a older whiskey. You know what? determine what you want. Do you want something that's easy drinking and that rye is kind of going to be muted in the experience? Do you want that rye more out front? Do you want it sweeter, or do you want it to be a little more on the darker side of things, a little bit more bourbony? Then that's the Rittenhouse. So I hope this guys has been very helpful for you guys, and really I feel much better now about my knowledge and experience with ryes, and I would highly suggest to you that if you feel that same awkwardness with ryes that I do, that these would be 3 good whiskeys to compare with each other to try to start getting a little bit more knowledge into rye whiskeys, and then move on from there, because there's a lot of them. If you want to try one that's Monongahela style, I hear Dad's Hat is in that style. You may want to go out and check that one out if you can find it. And, you know, I'm sure we will cross the path of rye whiskeys again somewhere down the road. And until next time, cheers and slàinte mhath.